So this morning we are talking in our Kid Wisdom series, and we're talking about, of course, the classic book, Green Eggs and Ham, which deceivingly has an orange cover. Never quite understood that, but that's okay. Now, Green Eggs and Ham actually has an interesting backstory to it. It was one of Dr. Seuss's earlier books, and it came about because of a bet. And his publisher basically bet him that he could not write a book that used 50 or less unique words. And if you go through it, there are only 50 unique words in the book. That's one of the reasons why things repeat as much as they do. And Dr. Seuss, of course, being Dr. Seuss, used exactly 50 words to write this book. And no doubt, he won this bet that I think it was like for $50 was the bet, but the publisher actually never paid up. But since he sold about 8 million copies of it, I think he did fine in the end. But even in this small amount of words, in this story that probably most of us know pretty well, there's a lot of wisdom in here. So if you don't know the story, I'm a little surprised, but if you don't remember it, there are basically two main characters. There is Sam I Am, who, for whatever reason we are not told, is walking around with a plate of food. And he comes across another character who is not named, who he attempts to convince to eat the food. The food in question being, of course, green eggs and ham. And so the story basically goes, and Sam offers it to them in many different varieties and in many different places, and asks them, would you eat it with a fox? Would you eat it with a goat? Would you eat it in a box? Would you eat it on a train? And on and on and on. And of course, the other character in the story refuses over and over again, I think my wife would argue quite correctly, to not eat the random green food that he's being presented to by a stranger. So there's a lot of lessons you learn from this story. I mean, obviously. I mean, I think the primary one, and then maybe the one that Seuss had in mind when he wrote it, is something that many of us who maybe we have kids or grandkids have probably said to our own children. You don't know if you don't like it if you haven't tried it, right? Some of us probably had that told to us as children, right? You know, I mean, you're given something new or interesting to eat at dinner time, and you announce that you don't like it, and of course your mom looks at you or your dad looks at you and says, you haven't even tried it, you don't know that. I still actually have a pretty active memory of about an hour and a half sitting at the dinner table staring at a steamed Brussels sprout, absolutely refusing to eat it, and Mom, if you're watching at home, that was disgusting. So we've all had that experience, right? And I think that's probably why he made them green and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's probably one of the things that Seuss was probably thinking about when he wrote this story. As I was kind of thinking about it and reflecting on it, though, I kind of wonder about the other kind of nameless character, who's kind of presented as this kind of grumpy guy who refuses to try the new thing. And I wonder about him because I wonder if he really isn't actually in some ways the hero of the story, as much as this story has a hero. And I say that because, not because he decides not to eat random green food, but that when he eventually gets to the point where he says, fine, if it means you'll leave me alone, I'll try it, right? Now, how many of us have actually had that friend who is always bugging us to try something, right? Maybe it's a restaurant or maybe it's a TV show, right? And you can't talk to that friend, and if you talk to that friend, they're going to bring up, oh, have you tried this yet? Have you eaten in this restaurant yet? Have you watched this TV show on Netflix yet? Right? And they just keep badgering you about it until you basically have to tell them to either stop or actually do it, right? Who's had that experience? Somebody? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if you haven't had that experience, that might be you. Just saying. But and what happens though? What happens though if somebody really does? If you read the story, he is not nice about this. This poor man is badgered into trying these green eggs and ham, and he basically finally says, "Fine, I'll try it." Right? It wouldn't have mattered if that steamed Brussels sprout had tasted like cotton candy. I wasn't going to like it, and I certainly wasn't going to admit that I liked it. Right? what is actually amazing about the story of Green Eggs and Ham, and amazing about the other character, is after being basically browbeaten by Sam I Am into trying this thing, not only does he like it, he's willing to admit that he likes it, right? He changes his mind, and he's willing to admit that he's changed his mind. And by doing that, he's also saying, it's one of the things when you admit when you are willing to change your mind, and you admit that you're willing to change your mind, and you admit that you're doing it, part of what you're admitting is maybe you weren't right before, right? One of the things that he's admitting when he says, no, actually, I really do like this, is that, well, maybe refusing to try it was not the best thing to do. I think this is why a lot of us struggle with changing our minds, right? And it's it's one of those weird human things. Once we've made up our mind about something, most people are really, really hard. It's really, really hard to change their minds about it, right? And the more that we're pushed, and the more that we're questioned about whatever it is, and the more that somebody insists on doing it, and the more entrenched we get into something, a way of thinking, the harder it is to break out of it. And the harder it is because we feel like that means that we have to somehow admit we were wrong or admit that we needed something. It's why a lot of us also struggle to ask for help even when we need help, right? And I know, because I know many of you, that I know many of you struggle for asking for help, because one of the things we have to do when we're asking for help is we have to admit there's something we can't do on our own. And sometimes I think we don't like to admit that there's things we can't do on our own. So for me, I think the guy, the nameless character in the story, gets a bit of a bad rap. And for me, I think he really, truly is the hero. And if there's a lesson to be taken from Dr. Seuss and Green Eggs and Ham, perhaps the lesson is being a willingness to change our minds, our willingness to try new things, a willingness to ask for help. Now, it may not seem like it, but there's actually a parallel between what's going on in Green Eggs and Ham and what's going on in the book of Isaiah. I promise you there is. It's not something I just made up. The book of Isaiah that we read from is a very long book of prophecy. You'll find it in the Old Testament. It's actually kind of broken up into three major sections and probably written at three different times. And we are in the third section of Isaiah. And if you heard at the beginning of the passage that was read today, there was a reference to Babylon, which kind of helps locate us in the story of God's people. And where we are in the story of God's people when this part of Isaiah is written is at a time when God's people are not actually in their land. They fled Egypt, right, in the Exodus story. They settled in the land, and they built a temple, but things happened, and their neighbors came in. One of their neighbors who came in were the Babylonians, who came in, conquered them, destroyed the temple, and then carried most of the people off, basically carried them back into slavery in Babylon. So when Isaiah is writing, and who he's writing to, is to this group of God's people, most of whom are not where they're supposed to be, most of whom are in exile in Babylon. And they have been there long enough that most of the folks who are there in exile are actually the children of the people who were carried away. So there aren't very many people. They were in exile long enough that there aren't that many people who actually remember firsthand living in the land that God promised them. And so what most people, all they've heard are stories. They've heard stories about how good the land is. They've heard stories about God's promises. They, of course, have heard the story of Moses. They've heard the story of the Exodus experience. They know all those stories, but they didn't live it, right? They weren't experienced in it. They hadn't seen it or touched it with their own eyes. So when Isaiah comes with this message that God's actually going to liberate God's people, deliver them from Babylon back to where they belong, many people, you would think, would be excited about this, right? I mean, living in servitude and slavery does not sound like a great deal to me. So you would think they would be excited about this, but because they don't really know and don't have experience of where they're going, there's actually some trepidation on behalf of them about if this is something they really actually want to do. One of the things that they, of course, know if they know the stories is the Exodus story. And, of course, the Exodus story is the story of God's people leaving Egypt and being delivered to the land, God's promised land. But if you remember that story, a journey that should have taken a couple of weeks took what? 40 years, right? And, in fact, most everybody who left Egypt didn't actually get to the land. It was their children that got there. Moses didn't even get to the land. He died before they were able to cross the river. And so you got to figure people got to be thinking, does going back, being delivered out of Babylon, does that mean we got to wander the desert for 40 years? Because that doesn't sound like fun. I think we already did that once. I don't think we want to do that again. So that's why Isaiah has to convince them that no, this return is going to be different. Right, so we get this passage today about being water and ways being made through the desert. That they're not being signed up for another $40 million 40-year meandering. So I don't know with inflation it might have cost that much. Who knows? They're not being signed up for that. That this is something different. Right, and God's trying to convince them, and kind of has to convince them that they actually do want to go back. And I think if we're honest, we can kind of see where they're coming from. Because even if their current situation isn't good, and of course being held in slavery is not good, it's what they know. And most of us get comfortable with what we know. So do we really want to take a risk on this new thing? So that's why God has to say, do not consider the things of old. Do not consider the way the last Exodus went. Do not consider where you have been. Because behold, I am God and I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? It's not that God isn't doing a new thing. God is doing a new thing. The new thing is not in question. It's not a question of if God is going to do a new thing. That is not the question. God is. It's a statement. I am doing a new thing. The question is, do you perceive it? Are your hearts and minds open to the new thing that God is trying to do? The new thing is there. The new thing is unfolding. The question is, are you willing to perceive it? Are you willing to see it? Are you willing to touch it? Or in the case of green eggs and ham, are you willing to taste it? Are you willing to learn that the new thing that I am doing is good? John Wesley, founder of Methodism, had what we call his Aldersgate experience. And in fact, we missed Aldersgate Day. That would have been May 24th. So May 24th is sometimes a celebrated day in the Methodist Church. It's known as Aldersgate Day. And it's known as the day that John Wesley was at a prayer meeting. And somebody at the prayer meeting was actually reading, not the Bible yet, they were reading Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans. They hadn't actually gotten to the book of Romans yet. He was reading Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans. And John Wesley recorded in his journal this. Martin Luther, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust Christ alone for salvation, and assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. We call this Aldersgate Day. We call it the experience of John Wesley having his heart strangely warmed. And he talks about the moment where he really did have a moment of trust and belief that all the things that he had learned and taught himself and known about God and God's grace and God's love and God's forgiveness, he talks about that moment where he recognized that all of those things, all those great and wonderful things about God, weren't just true for other people, they were true for him too. That the forgiveness and the grace and the peace and the trust and the love that that we talk about all the time around here, that we talk about the fact that God offers that to everybody. John Wesley had that moment where he recognized he was part of everybody. In the church, we actually talk about that. In Wesleyan thinking, we talk about 3 different kinds of grace. We talk about prevenient grace, the grace that goes before us before we even know who God is. That's Sam I Am running around, chasing you wherever you want, wherever he happened to go, continually offering him something he knew was good. That's God's prevenient grace, though sometimes probably a lot less annoying than Sam I Am was. Though probably also, God can be annoying if you haven't noticed. God will mess up your stuff, let me just say. So we talk about prevenient grace. That is that moment. That is God's grace going before us, continually making that invitation to us, continually asking us, continually being available to us, continually asking us, encouraging us, whatever words we want to use, compelling us to live into the love and the grace that we're being offered. And we can never run away from it because God will find us. That's prevenient grace. Then we also talk about justifying grace. Justifying grace is what Wesley experienced in that moment, where he recognized that the offer that was being offered to everyone was actually being offered to him too. And that the trust and the faith everyone's invited to have in God through Christ was open to him as well. That's that moment where, rather begrudgingly, our nameless character says, fine, I will try the green eggs and ham. And then we talk about, in the Methodist Church, we also then talk about what is called perfecting grace or sanctifying grace. The fact that even after we recognize that God's grace is for us, the forgiveness for us, that the trust is for us, that even after that moment, God isn't done with us. That God continues to work on us, continues to help us grow, continues to help us mature, continues to help us be even more the disciples we are called to be. We are all offered something. All the time. And sometimes it may feel as obvious as somebody shoving a plate of food under our face, and sometimes it may not feel that obvious at all. But we're all continually being offered something good. The thing that, of course, we're being offered is the forgiveness, love, and grace that only God can provide. It's not a question of whether God is doing that. It's not a question if God is working new things in our lives, in the life of the church, in the life of our country. It's not a question about whether it's happening. The only question is, do we perceive it? Are our hearts and minds open to the new experience? Because here's the thing. God will find us in a boat. God will find us with a goat, in the rain, on a train, in a tree. Yes, you see, God will find us in a box. God will find us with a fox, in a house or with a mouse. God will find us here and there. God will find us everywhere. One of the places that we are invited to find God this morning is at the communion table. This place where we get to actually taste the grace of God, where we get to feel God's presence among us. And we get to come to the table that Christians have always come to receive the gift that has always been offered to us. May we perceive it, all that it is. I'll invite you to join with me in our communion liturgy.